I think the unfortunate thing with paranormal experience is that it tends to start young, and depending on how it's handled in childhood can reflect how it affects you for the rest of your life. So for me, I was just totally consumed by fear, and unfortunately that negative emotion and the intensity of it really provided a power source for the manifestations that were happening. I think if we can present to children that it's not negative to experience spirits and energy, and that they can then react more positively and project a positive rather than a fearful set of emotions, they'll attract more positive outcomes and appreciate what is really a blessing to experience the spirit world. And it's taken me up until my 30s to get to that point, and it would be wonderful, as with my children, if it could be accepted by humanity as a natural and normal part of life that we can embrace. My earliest memories were lying in my cot and just being totally surrounded by red and blue, beautiful lights. Night after night, it was the same thing. And they'd come from the corner of the room, they'd get closer and closer until I was totally enveloped in them. And then they would turn into faces. And they were the faces of the most beautiful Asian children you could imagine. So much detail, they had light coming from within them, and every single one you could tell that they absolutely loved me. So as well as being my earliest memory, these were my earliest contacts with spirit. Although at the time I didn't realise, I just thought, wow, this is beautiful. And through the innocence of childhood, I just enjoyed it. And then once I started school and I got older, it struck me as, okay, well, how come I've got all these people, these kids in my room? And I asked my parents, and I said, firstly, what are the red and blue lights? They said, you're tired, your eyes are playing tricks on you. And they said the same about the children. And ridiculously, I accepted this, and I kept seeing these kids for years and years. And I just thought, it's what happened when you were tired, and wasn't that so awesome? And when I remember the clarity with how I saw these faces, it just makes me yearn for that same intense ability that I had as a child, because nowadays I don't see the spirit world as clearly. I see figures, I see lots of lights, mostly the orbs. For a ghost energy, I do see solid, detailed figures, but I tend to see spirit more, which I think in itself is a beautiful validation that most of us cross to spirit rather than remain earthbound and become ghosts. But still, the vividness just doesn't compare to how I saw as a child. And I do think that most, if not all, children are born with that sensitivity since they've arrived from the spirit world recently themselves, so they're in tune with that. And I think for myself that having nearly died at birth, I had that experience of teetering between the two dimensions, and they say that once you have seen spirit, you can't unsee it. So perhaps that's why I have retained that sensitivity to this day, where I still see spirits. And with the books, I guess they just began out of a desire to write, and I actually started writing fiction, and more spiritual stuff and reality was seeping into my fiction work, to the point where I thought, well, this is ridiculous. So I scrapped it and I started from scratch and began writing about the lights, the faces and the visitors, which unfortunately, as time went on and I became affected by the opinions of others and Hollywood and the general population's perception of ghosts, fear overtook my initial joyousness. So then that negativity and that intense, fearful pot of emotion that's constantly simmered within me began to attract fearful manifestations. I am convinced that what we put out, we attract and reap in return, and this was a classic example. And fortunately for me, I did travel the full circle. So I went from that loving acceptance in the early years to fear, particularly as a teenager. And during that time, I lived through a 5-year poltergeist haunting, which, looking back on, I don't know how I survived and came out normal. In fact, I'm thankful for it because I think it's enriched me. So my teen years were totally consumed by fear, particularly because of the poltergeist activity that was happening in my home and that I was unwittingly fueling with the intensity of my emotion. Anything like that needs a power source to manifest. If a glass is going to fly across a table, or if lids are going to start popping off jars, or cupboards slamming, or glasses breaking, whatever the physical manifestation, it needs a power source. And unfortunately for me, the fact that I was a budding medium, and a terrified one at that, made me a prime target. And I guess the haunting fueled itself, because with every subsequent event that happened, I became more and more terrified, and then that in itself fed further manifestations. So it's something that's very, very difficult to escape when you're in the thick of it. At the time, I didn't understand it at all, and I had no idea that my fear was fueling these events. But even if I had known, I really don't think I could have kept them in check, because it is an all-consuming thing that's happening. And I'm talking about, it was really, looking back, bullying behaviour, having doors slam shut in front of your face just as you're about to pass through them, being pushed off ladders, pushed down on the bed, lights flicking on and off. Really, really terrifying. Although, having said that, if the same thing happened right now, viewing it from the perspective where I am now, I'd be going, awesome, that's great, thank you guys, thank you. And that's because I've come to realise as well, a lot of these more out there displays of paranormal activity are very rarely the evil event that we perceive them to be. They are usually an attention-seeking behaviour by someone who is reaching out to me as a medium wanting help. As recently as 12 months ago, I was woken up by someone shaking my bed, and my initial instinct when I woke up was absolute terror, and I turned on the touch lamp, and of course they chose a night when my husband wasn't there. But then it was like, hang on guys, this is unacceptable. Who is this and what do you want? And as it turned out, it was a young boy who had passed away, well, a young man of 20 years of age who had sadly taken his own life. And he came in contact with me through a reporter from the West who came to interview me. And so having that link, he thought, right, here's a lady who's going to give me some attention. And it worked for him, because once I realised who it was and what he wanted and passed on the message that he requested I give his parents, which was nothing more than letting them know that he was okay and that he was sorry and that he was continuing on his journey from a joyful place, he didn't visit me ever again. And most of these behaviours are people who have died in a state where there's more to be said, there are unresolved issues, they need to pass on a message. And for him, that was a good way to get my attention, which I could have perceived as absolutely terrifying. But logic stepped in and I realised who it was and what they wanted. So I think that for me, the blessing has been travelling that full circle from acceptance to really being challenged and fearful to being where I am now, which is thankful and very, very grateful and blessed to see what I see and experience what I experience. because without a skerrick of a doubt, I know that we are so much more than this physical being that we see before us. Life goes on despite death. Death is not the scary, big, dark veil. It is a homecoming. Love never dies. We are forever connected with our loved ones, and we're travelling our different journeys, but will ultimately always be together. And even if someone said to me, "You poor thing, your teen years were terrible. Let's wipe all that out. Let's replace it with this beautiful memory. Have these 10 years. You don't have to have experienced that." I would say no, because those experiences have made me what I am today. And for that, I am just so, so thrilled, because having the spirit world enmeshed within my own and being sensitive to it has been an absolute blessing. And sometimes the toughest journeys are the best ones, and people have had much worse than a few things thrown around the room, haven't they? Even in my day-to-day work life, having patients come in totally unaware of my abilities and seeing them surrounded by these beautiful flashing lights, whether they be their spirit guides or their loved ones who've passed away, it's so, so life-affirming, because it shows me that no one's ever alone. We're surrounded by beautiful spirit energy, and we are more protected than we can ever truly realise. And when I see these beautiful lights around others, it reminds me that I too have got my entourage and my protection. And it's truly, truly life-enhancing to realise that the spirit world and the material world are so, so closely enmeshed, and that there is so much love and positive energy around us all. I think that facing up to the poltergeist activity, which was the most terrifying aspect for me in my past, is what has helped me to reach the point where I am now, which is being comfortable and embracing my abilities. And my next book, Embracing the Spirits, actually begins with experiencing poltergeist activity again for the first time since I was a teenager. And this happened about 2 years ago. And it was confronting, but it was life-affirming and wonderful as well. I'd been invited to do a haunting investigation in the southwest, and went to a hotel, which I've changed the name in the book so that they don't get inundated. But the owners had complained of a disturbance which was very, very physical and quite violent. And my first instinct was to not place myself in this situation, because I was very mindful of inviting this sort of energy into my life. And particularly having children, it was something that I balked at. But I was talked into it. I was reminded what a good chapter it would make for my next book, and indeed it did. And this was something beyond which I could even comprehend. I'd experienced physical manifestations of spirit energy before. I'd seen things picked up and moved and doors slammed, but this was something completely different. And what happened, as well as banging and the usual physical manifestation of poltergeists, stones were actually raining indoors, as though they were coming from thin air or pouring through the ceiling. So it was a tangible, overwhelming event. Even thinking about it now gives me goosebumps. But as well as thinking, wow, that was scary, another part of me thinks, how awesome is that something can manifest out of nothingness. I was cowering in a corner, I was hyperventilating, I was crying, but I was awestruck, and I was grateful for the experience. And the spirit in question, he did attach himself to me, and I had to move him on. And as much as I balked and was scared of having this spirit attached to me, it was such a valuable lesson, helping him to cross over and to not be the angry entity in a dark hallway hurling stones and banging and being violent, but making that transition to where he should be. And he'd been there for 70 years, since the 1940s. And it's the classic example of what I said earlier. On face value, one would think, that is so evil, this is negative, get out, get out. But the reality was, he was not an evil man. He was a frightened soul, trapped in a location for 70 odd years, interacting with the living as only he could. And I think that rather than doing what a lot of ghost hunters do, get out, be gone, and approaching negatively, by approaching him with love and compassion, the manifestation just dropped immediately. And over the coming weeks, helping this soul to progress to where he needs to be was a wonderful experience, sometimes challenging and sometimes confronting, but ultimately rewarding and wonderful. And it is with this story that I start the book, Embracing the Spirits, because it just epitomises what it is to embrace the spirit world, whether it manifests positively, lovingly, or frighteningly. And that was one of the very rare times in my 45 years that, well, recent years, that I've had a frightening experience. And even though it did appear to be the worst of the worst, the way the story panned out, it was really quite lovely. And it just reinforces as well, the spirit world is not to be feared. It is life-enhancing, it is beautiful, and all spirits deserve love and attention, no matter how naughty they're being. Remember that.